It's my pleasure to introduce this panel and the opportunity to discuss some emerging technologies in the space domain, reflecting on some comments from our opening keynotes. It's true that early mechanisms of space governance had the bold attempt of being prescriptive, governing activities in an environment where innovative technology rules, and the distant future of space operations is often one that intertwines real technological developments with mere thoughts and ideas. And today we want to disentangle some of those facts from realities. And I want to commend Unidir and the organizing partners of this conference this week because it's challenging to combine technological areas of expertise with policy practice. And so in a slate of emerging technologies, including artificial intelligence, autonomous systems, quantum communication, and cyber architectures requires specialization from our panelists who are joining me today. In my work in academia, I focus on using machine learning techniques to better understand satellite object behavior, certainly a silo in and of itself. And so it's my pleasure to introduce our guests to help fill some of these gaps and help us understand where technology meets innovation and distant thought. So I want to introduce one panelist at a time, and I invite them to share some opening remarks on our selected themes. Our first speaker is Ioana Bratu. She's an assistant professor in space law at the VU in Amsterdam and the founder of its Space Law and Sustainability Center. Ioana.
Excellencies, distinguished guests, and colleagues and friends from Unidir, thank you very much for the invitation and for the opportunity to discuss such important topics alongside the international audience and colleagues. It was already mentioned that we are celebrating an important milestone this month, almost 1 year from the adoption of the Pact of the Future. But also today, so in fact, as we speak, the Security Council holds the open debate on the future for peace operations, taking stock of progress since 1 year since the Pact of the Future adoption. The role of the Pact of the Future should be at the center of any international discussions concerning the future of governance and regulation of AI and quantum technologies. There are multiple discussions surrounding artificial intelligence these days, and it has become increasingly important to understand and clarify the legal regime applicable to these technologies. In the space sector, the deployment of AI applications has evolved from a niche experiment into a critical component of modern space systems. According to publicly available estimates, the deployment of AI in space operation market is currently valued at $1.7 billion in 2024, and it is estimated to reach $11.3 billion by 2032. We are already seeing the results of such large investments. For instance, artificial intelligence is increasingly integrated into various aspects of space exploration and operations, such as satellite image processing to monitor environmental changes, track deforestation, and analyze natural disasters. These systems can process vast amounts of data from Earth observation satellites more efficiently than traditional methods. Similarly, autonomous navigation systems, such as those employed by the Mars rovers, allow independent analysis of the environment, they plan routes, and they avoid obstacles, reducing reliance on real-time human intervention. AI systems are being applied also in mission planning and spacecraft operation, assisting astronauts. And in space debris management, AI systems are being developed to predict collision risks and optimize the maneuvers of satellites to avoid potential impacts. In what concerns quantum technologies, similar tendencies are observed. For instance, in the quantum strategy of Europe, released very recently in July 2025, The strategy anticipates that the quantum sector's value will exceed 155 billion euro by 2040. And the same strategy indicates that the EU and member states already invested 11 billion euro over the past 5 years, covering various applications of quantum technology. In light of such increasing investments, consequently leading to multiple applications, it becomes stringently important to clarify the legal regime applicable to these technologies. We should be especially preoccupied how we, as a diverse international community, ensure that AI and quantum technologies are deployed for supporting peace and security on Earth and in outer space. What are the actions that we need to take, or what are the actions that we should refrain from in order to ensure that advanced technologies do not become an instrument of conflict and warfare? The discussion today is particularly relevant since both AI and quantum applications are inherently dual use, serving both civilian and military domains. In the current complex geopolitical environment, this duality must be directed for enabling and conserving stability and cooperation. The interdependency between AI or quantum and space systems requires framing their deployment not only in terms of operational advantage, but also as a means of maintaining and supporting peace, security, and the long-term sustainability of the outer space environment. Moreover, advancing AI and quantum capabilities in orbit should and must provide an opportunity to enhance equality, trust, and predictability among states. Therefore, the main question is, how should laws be enacted to support such goals? And what are the next steps for implementing the Pact of the Future, which provides, among its objectives, the need to enhance international governance of artificial intelligence for the benefit of humanity? Thank you.
Thank you for those remarks. Ioana is perhaps too humble to not mention that she is a pioneer thought leader at the intersection of space law and AI. And I'd be remiss not to comment about the sort of detectable change in tone for me as an engineer in this room between how we gather and speak about AI issues in space and how the spacecraft engineering community gathers and speaks about AI in space. As you know well in this room, treaty obligations very much allow individual operators great freedom on orbit to control their spacecraft in the ways of their choosing. And satellite operators are already employing AI-enabled systems to chase efficiencies, make satellites last longer, do more things with fewer paid engineers on staff instructing them to do so. And so we're privileged to be able to have the conversation in this room where we honor those innovations, but also touch upon some of the implications when it relates to space governance mechanisms. And I look forward to your remarks in response to some audience questions later on. Next, I want to turn our attention to Jana Malekos-Smith. Jana is a senior associate at the Center for Strategic International Studies Aerospace Security Project and holds active affiliations with New York University, the United Nations Institute for Training and Research, and our own very own UNIDIR. Jana.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and esteemed guests. Thank you for the opportunity to speak today and contribute to this important discussion. It's truly an honor, and I thank UNIDIR for the invitation. Because this panel is titled Fact or Fiction, and tomorrow we will hear from a science fiction writer about how science fiction can inform space governance, I thought it necessary and proper to introduce some ancient and trusted wisdom in grappling with the question of this panel, which is understanding the future of emerging technologies in space. And no, Thomas, I did not bring my trusted magic 8-ball. We're going farther back in antiquity with some tarot cards. The first card that we have, the Magician. Perhaps a precautionary note about trusting commercial space vendors who tell you that AI is magic and can do any trick in outer space. Friends, it cannot pull a rabbit out of a dark hole. The second card that we have is the Lovers, perhaps symbolizing the on-again, off-again romance between government entities and commercial space companies when it comes to sharing data. And as we heard earlier from Ms. Bogdan-Martin, partnerships in key partnerships in space are key. The last card that we'll draw is the tower. Now, as some of you may know, this card represents sudden upheaval, destruction, and unexpected consequences. So naturally, I thought this is a perfect segue to talk about space data ethics. Because the truth is, as we rush to integrate AI, autonomous satellite systems, and quantum tools into orbit without thinking about how we govern the data that flows between them, we are in essence building towers of our own with very shaky foundations. So why does space data ethics matter? Well, for several reasons, but first let's define the terms. When we think about data ethics, we most likely imagine at the individual level personal data. And by that, I'm referring to data that concerns privacy, surveillance, and consent. So how is space data different than this? Well, rather than focus at the personal level, it's focusing on Earth. It's looking at imagery of crops, of oceans, of borders, looking at disasters and infrastructure. And this type of data powers climate monitoring models, national security tools, commercial forecasting, and humanitarian responses. And as the 2023 NASA white paper on space data ethics makes clear, just because this data isn't personal doesn't mean it's harmless. Space data is a powerful tool for the following reasons. Space data can be weaponized. It can be used to manipulate markets, exploit natural resources, or gain military advantage. The second, it can exacerbate inequalities when only powerful actors have access to this tool to interpret it and act upon it. And third, it can destabilize trust. When autonomous systems make decisions based on opaque or biased data flows, in short, space data, once a trusted, relatively neutral scientific resource, is now a strategic asset and a potential vulnerability. So what are the ethical tensions that we're exploring in emerging technology? As we integrate space-based AI, autonomy, and quantum communication, these ethical tensions are becoming operational challenges. Take data minimization, for example. In conventional data ethics, we only collect what is needed, the essential pieces of information. But in space science, it's different. We often don't know what data will become essential until it's too late. So there's an uncomfortable tension there in that trade-off of minimizing now could mean potentially closing yourself off from critical early warnings in the future. Do you want to take that risk? Then there's the issue of sharing and control, and the more open our space data is, the more it can support disaster response, transparency, and supporting a higher good, the summum bonum, if you will. But openness also increases risk of espionage, risk of commercial misuse, use of cyber tools for exploitation. Then there's the issue of accountability. With AI-enabled satellites, which my colleague, Ms. Bratu, spoke eloquently of, when these tools start interpreting data or even making decisions autonomously, who ultimately bears the responsibility when something goes awry? Should it be the developer? Should it be the nation state? These scenarios aren't science fiction examples, they're fast approaching realities. And that's why NASA's white paper recommends launching a dedicated interdisciplinary study to bring together AI ethicists, data ethicists, space scientists, and legal scholars and policymakers to talk about, as a cross-sector dialogue, what are our defining principles to guide data stewardship in space? Principles that will reflect the scientific needs, national interests, and global equity. Most importantly, it's about building trust between spacefaring nations, between the public and private actors, and between those who collect the data and those who are impacted by it. So in closing, why do I raise this issue of ethics on a panel about emerging technologies in space security? Because every one of these technologies that you'll hear about on this panel, AI, quantum tools, and autonomy, cyber architectures, they run on data. And how we govern that data shapes whether these systems promote cooperation or competition, stability, or strategic risk. In closing, rather than leaving space governance to fate, or in this case, tarot cards, or guesswork, we need real ethical frameworks rooted in science, law, and multilateral cooperation. Because without responsible governance of the data that fuels these very systems, we risk undermining the very stability and security that we seek to enhance. Thank you.
Thank you, Jana. You know, while I was coming up to the stage, I did see the tarot cards at the end of the table, and I thought maybe Jana will sit there. And I always look forward to Jana's remarks, and this contribution was no different. I'm looking forward to your contributions during our Q&A session, especially when it comes to the ethics of AI in decision-making. Next, I want to turn it over to my colleague, Letitia Cesari. She is a space lawyer and a consultant of the team here at Unidir. Take it away.
Good morning, Excellencies, distinguished participants, ladies and gentlemen in your ranks and titles. Let me thank the United Nations Institute for Disarmament Research for organizing these very important and timely discussions. Very proud of the team for putting together such a high quality panel. And this is happening year after year, and it's always a pleasure to be here. And this panel is focusing on very timely discussions on emerging technologies and their impact to outer space sector. And I thank Dr. Thomas Gonzalez-Roberts for moderating this panel. So what we've noticed for the past few years at the multilateral level is that states are actively considering the main threats faced by space infrastructure, particularly within the framework of the agenda item on the prevention of an arms race in outer space at the Conference on Disarmament. This highlights the growing recognition that technological developments bring not only opportunities, but also challenges that require careful consideration in order to preserve outer space as a safe, secure, and sustainable domain, as it has been repeated several times this morning. Multilateral efforts in these fields are encouraging. The adoption of the Group of Governmental Experts report on the prevention of an arms race in outer space in 2024, alongside the recent approval of the 2025 final reports on the open-ended working group on security, use of information and communication technologies, demonstrates that progress is possible when states work together constructively, and discussions are also continuing within the open-ended working group on PAROS in all its aspects, reflecting the sustained commitment of the international community to address these challenges. These developments are indeed a positive sign that dialogue and cooperation remain central to advancing space security in the responsible use of emerging technologies. So more specifically, while exchanging on these concerns, the 2024 Group of Governmental Experts on further practical measures for PAROS agreed that the provisions of a potential legally binding instruments on PAROS should be, among other criteria, practical, clear, but also scientifically and technically accurate. This also means that diplomats are increasingly called upon to deepen their understanding of fast-moving technological developments and their potential implications for international security, including in outer space. This is essential not only to identify how these technologies could be misused or become disruptive, but also to explore ways of mitigating such risks through the promotion of transparency and confidence-building measures. So in the report, the group carefully examined the full spectrum of threats to space systems. In doing so, experts identify 4 vectors of concern: Earth to space, space to space, space to Earth, and Earth to Earth. And these threats may take both kinetic and non-kinetic form, producing effects that range from temporary and reversible to permanent and irreversible. The group also acknowledged that the perception of such threats can differ among states, and this is particularly important when it comes to emerging technologies, underscoring the need for continued dialogue and mutual understanding. So regarding emerging technology threats, researchers noted that the space-to-space and Earth-to-Earth vectors may at some point be particularly affected by this type of disruptions, highlighting the importance of anticipating future challenges as technological innovation continue to advance for the best, but also for the worst. So for this reason, responsible approaches to the use of emerging technologies, which may raise concerns in the context of space activities, are particularly important. At the same time, there is a growing awareness of the indirect risks, including the possibility of large language models being exploited for malicious purposes, such as automating disruptive cyber operation and enabling the faster and more effective deployment of harmful software, for instance. These challenges highlight the need for continued dialogue and collective efforts to foster trust, accountability, and the safe application of innovation in outer space, but also in other sectors, cybersecurity, in the use of artificial intelligence, and as my colleagues say, quantum computing and its future uses. So because these topics are so specific and so technically complex, it is all the more important that experts, civil society, and in particular research centers are closely involved in these discussions. Their insights can help inform deliberation with the necessary technical depth and provide a broader perspective on the implication of emerging technologies. By drawing on this expertise, multilateral processes can benefit from a stronger evidence base, ensuring that policy responses are both well-informed and responsive to the realities of technological innovation. In this regard, UNIDIR, through its space security program, but also its security and technology program, is here to support these efforts and is honored to contribute to advancing inclusive and informed dialogue on space security, emerging information and communication technologies, and also other technologies, as well as their intersections. Thank you for your time, and I appreciate to speak today, and I look forward to our exchanges.
Thank you, Letitia. And I want to acknowledge how much of it's becoming a full-time job to really track the workings of open-ended working groups and to better understand and diagnose the threats to space systems, especially in the focus area of Letitia, threats to the cyber security systems that enable space telecommunications. And just this past year, Letitia was a principal contributor to one of my favorite efforts to track these threats to space systems, the Secure World Foundation's Global Counterspace Capabilities Report, which I understand is available on the tables outside for those of you in person, if you haven't run out already. Okay, come back tomorrow. Also available online and complementing the work of my colleagues at the Center for Strategic and International Studies in Washington, DC. Lastly, but without further ado, I want to turn the floor over to my colleague, Simon Clairbury. He is the head of Arms Control and Disarmament at the Geneva Center for Security Policy, just down the road here in Geneva. Simon.
Thank you very much indeed, Thomas, and good morning, everyone. At the GCSP, we've been running a series of track 2 dialogues on space security. One of the things that we have tried to focus in on is what we're calling defining the problem. What do we mean by space security? What do we want to achieve by it? Or perhaps putting it another way, what do we want to avoid? Now, one of the things, or one of the implications of all this rapidly emerging technology is it makes that exercise of defining the problem much more complicated and complex. And so understanding what the technology does, how it will be used, and then keeping up to speed with those developments is, as we've been hearing from fellow panelists, very difficult and complex and technical. And so this question of understanding what's going on is I think, fundamental to space security. I'm going to focus my remarks on the impact of emerging technologies on strategic stability. People define this in different ways, but I'm primarily talking about relations between the major spacefaring nations, many of whom happen to be major militaries and also the ones that are nuclear armed. These major spacefaring nations, particularly the ones that are nuclear armed, rely on space in three particular areas of concern. The first is nuclear command, control, and communication, so-called NC3. Then the monitoring of arms control agreements, and thirdly, global positioning for their militaries. So space is crucial for so many things, but space, of course, is crucial for nuclear command, control, and communications. Any attack or perceived attack on an NC3 system would be hugely destabilizing and could lead to escalation, making conflict and nuclear conflict at that more likely. And when you add in what we're hearing about the use of AI, the AI nuclear nexus, then the potential for something to go wrong increases. Space assets are also used for monitoring arms control agreements. Perhaps it's more accurate today to say that they're monitoring what potential adversaries are doing. And then in the same vein, space assets are used to support militaries in their global positioning. And again, any attacks on systems that do these things could have a very destabilizing effect on strategic stability. The rapid development of technology and the increase in perceived threats to space systems means that states are, I think, constantly having to recalculate their adversaries' capabilities. The speed at which technology is developing, taken together with a lack of transparency, means that states could overestimate potential adversaries' capabilities and believe that they need to catch up. That's the classic security dilemma. And it then does lead to fears of a kind of technological arms race in space. And that, again, is what we're trying to avoid and could be very destabilizing. So as the title of this panel suggests, there is a lot of uncertainty, I think, about exactly what capabilities are out there. And it comes at a time when trust is very low amongst the major powers, and these uncertainties around where emerging technology is going, I think, makes it even harder to break that cycle of distrust. I think a couple of big headline items at the moment are examples of this uncertainty. President Trump's announcement on Golden Dome, for example. No one's quite sure whether this is actually going to happen and whether it will work. But the fact that he claims that it will end the missile threat to the US within 3 years changes the strategic stability calculus. Another example is the US concern that the Russian Federation has a covert program to develop a space-based anti-satellite capability armed with a nuclear weapon. Both of these are out there in the news. Fact or fiction? I don't know, but these, I think, are feeding into the uncertainties and have potential implications for space security, of course. So that's why I believe that I believe in the importance of dialogue, and this is all happening at a time when there's not enough dialogue at the track 1 level. As I said, at the GCSP, we're trying to facilitate dialogue amongst experts to try and talk through these issues, perhaps in a less polarized and politicized environment. And one thing I do really believe we need to do more of, particularly here in Geneva, is to bring together the scientific and technical experts to find solutions to these security challenges. It was very encouraging to hear what's happening at the ITU and what's happening at UNUSA, but I think in the security world, we should do that too. One thing that I think, one area I think that is really going to be very important is verification. I know, Thomas, you work a lot on that. I think that's something that has the potential to perhaps break through some of the polarization of the two approaches on space security. And I think that needs to be explored more. Finally, just a quick word on what all this means for the intergovernmental processes on space security. I think, as I've been saying, it's a very complex picture, and we're talking a lot at the moment about integration of these emerging technologies into weapon systems, conventional as well as weapons of mass destruction, biological, chemical, and nuclear, as well as in the space domain. We also talk about all these different nexuses: the space cyber nexus, the space nuclear nexus, the space AI nexus, and I mentioned the AINC3 nexus. So it's a very complicated picture, and it's very overlapping. And I think it's important that those of us who work on security find the right fora to discuss these issues and try to have a holistic, a cross-cutting approach to make sure that they're all being considered, albeit, of course, the different bodies and different working groups and different bodies have different mandates. I'll leave it there.
Thank you for your organization's efforts to continue fruitful conversations via Track 2 dialogues when Track 1 dialogues face so much challenge. And in those environments, in those Track 1 settings, there might be debate of fact or fiction, but also the much more uncomfortable truth or lie. And this is where I think the technical community can very much contribute, as Simon alluded to, mechanisms of verification, often directly and thanks to some of these innovative emerging technologies. I'm talking about AI-enabled spaceflight characterization or quantum-enabled passive detection of who's using what portion of the radio frequency, when, and how. These are critical questions of spaceflight practice that highlight the administration of rules that this community has worked so hard to achieve and add to the books. With that, I want to transition to the Q&A portion of this event. To reiterate Almu's remarks earlier, those of you who are listening online, we encourage you to participate in this process too. Just to remind you, you can use the Zoom Q&A function to ask questions, but please do include your name, title, and affiliation, and keep your remarks short and focused. To ask one clear question, you may direct it at one member of our panel or more than one. But I'll use the moderator's prerogative to ask a question to each of our panelists who will speak just briefly on some of these topics. The first one is for you, Iona. Emerging technologies are often presented, as we've done today, admittedly, with utopian or dystopian narratives that I think can be helpful for sharing some of these details of how they work, but also distinctly unhelpful. How can we realistically assess the current development of emerging technologies like autonomous systems, AI, or quantum communications, and their applications to space systems and the legal mechanisms that govern them?
I will answer, as a lawyer. And usually we stay away from utopian and dystopian narratives, although they are helpful. So to realistically try to assess the state of development, we should begin by clarifying the terminology, to work with definitions. And again, lawyers, we like to work with definitions, but sometimes we don't have them. And the first step would be trying to understand the difference between different types of AI systems, such as narrow AI versus strong AI, the latter also being referred to as artificial general intelligence. And we tried to do this in our latest UNIDIR report, Visionary versus Reactionary, written together with my distinguished colleague Almudena. And we found it difficult. But again, narrow AI versus general AI. Narrow AI, also known as weak AI, involves systems designed to perform specific tasks and requires extensive human oversight in programming and configuration to maintain their intelligence. Examples include expert systems that operate based on explicit rules formulated by humans for stable environments and mimic expertise and reasoning processes in a specific given field. In contrast, general or strong AI refers to systems that demonstrate a high level of autonomy and adaptability comparable to human intelligence. These systems can adapt their behavior, allowing them to apply knowledge from one context to a variety of others, signaling a move towards more sophisticated AI capabilities. Currently, there is no internationally legally binding treaty or convention defining artificial intelligence. A first step in this direction is represented by the Council of Europe's Framework Convention on Artificial Intelligence, Human Rights, Democracy, and the Rule of Law, adopted in May 2024, and it's currently open for signatures. This aims to be the first internationally binding treaty on AI. At regional level, a binding framework is the European AI Act, already in force, and also quite advanced in what concerns the legislative process, the upcoming Brazilian AI Act, both of them attempting to define AI systems not without difficulties. One of the reasons why the EU AI Act, the process for the EU AI Act was very long and difficult was actually the definition of AI. Your annexes, then they deleted the annexes, they added the definition in the body of the regulation, they amended it. So it was almost 3 years of negotiations among EU member states and other relevant stakeholders on how to define AI. So therefore, ideally, we can understand the technology if we have legislation in place. However, as we know, the development of AI systems happened at a different pace than the adoption of legislation. We had to deal with the so-called moving target that my colleague also mentioned, where policymakers had to catch up with technological advancements and not the other way around. Now, a question would be if we still need to adopt and implement reactive regulation, reactive governance, or do we need other types of regulation and governance, adaptive or proactive regulations to deal with this type of emerging technologies? And I realize I asked more questions than to answer. But if time allows me, I will very quickly read the definition for AI systems that we currently have in the European AI Act, and I'll leave it up to you if this definition is clear and solves our problem. Article 3, AI systems refer to a machine-based system that is designed to operate with varying levels of autonomy and that may exhibit adaptiveness after deployment, and that, for explicit or implicit objectives, infers from the input it receives how to generate outputs such as predictions, content recommendations, or decisions that can influence physical or virtual environments. Thank you.
It's bold work to define definitions like AI or AI-enabled systems because it requires operators to confront the limitations of their innovation. For example, I'm new to the term weak AI, but I will say that what you described as weak AI is the same technology that space companies brag about on the front page of their websites about AI-enabled spacecraft systems. They're often using AI to solve operational level questions, the day-to-day questions of what a satellite does. It's pretty funny that that's called weak. I might agree in context with strong AI. And thank you for highlighting that impressive work with UNIDIR. That work is called Visionary versus Reactionary: The Future of Space Security in the Age of Artificial Intelligence, one of the many research products developed by our colleagues at UNIDIR's Space Security Program. My next question is for you, Jana, and it's about the most critical ethical gaps that you see regarding the use of AI in outer space, and what specific principles should be considered to ensure responsible use of these technologies.
I'll start first by offering a few ethical principles to guide it and then pan the camera farther back to talk about the gaps in the legal governance framework. One ethical principle I would advance is the precautionary principle. And in this scenario, it would advance the idea of prohibiting or limiting the deployment of autonomous systems where the consequences are irreversible or poorly understood. Another ethical principle ties into the idea of auditability. Will the AI systems be able to produce verifiable logs of the decisions when trying to wrestle the idea of attribution of fault when an AI system malfunctions, when there is a collision in orbit or another adverse consequence? The second component of that is prioritizing the human in the loop, requiring real-time human oversight over critical decision-making for target identification and collision avoidance. In terms of the legal gaps that I see, the Outer Space Treaty of 1967, the seminal document, does not expressly account for autonomous systems or non-human decision makers. And the lack of verification of autonomous behavior compliance with international law is an opportunity for growth and discussion with multinational groups to discuss what should be the ethical way forward in trying to promote stability and reduce the risk of conflict. The deliberate targeting of commercial satellites, if I could pivot briefly to talking about the challenge that Ms. Bratu mentioned earlier of dual-use systems and ambiguity in targeting. The targeting of commercial systems, which serve both civilian and a military purpose, implicates a whole array of complex legal obligations, including international telecommunications law, the Outer Space Treaty, and non-binding norms, such as guidelines on space debris mitigation. We're seeing now the rise of autonomy in increasingly congested near-Earth space, facilitating the move towards what has been deemed trusted autonomous satellite operations, TASO. And while AI promises significant benefits in performance and adaptability, fully autonomous systems still face the same array of technical, legal, and ethical challenges, especially around safety, trust, and certification, which ties in my remarks earlier talking about accountability for increasingly automated systems operating beyond immediate human control. Thank you.
Thank you, Jana. And I know we're already seeing some questions from online, so I'll ask the next question to Letitia, one more for Simon, and then we'll open it up not just to guests online, but those of you in the room. Letitia, do emerging technologies create greater cyber vulnerabilities for space systems? And if so, are we making progress in creating cyber secure architectures for space systems, considering the development of emerging technologies, or is this still more of a goal than reality?
Thank you very much for this question, because indeed we kind of expect various technologies to be used for beneficial purposes, but also for disruptive and malicious purposes. This is one example, AI, that could be misused in order to access specific content or disrupt specific infrastructure. So indeed, with regards to AI, or at least a large language model, if I can use this example, enhancing space threats, I would like to mention what we call the dark prompting, which is a practice that refers to the indirect criminal exploitation of these LLMs, so the large language models, via hijacked interfaces, which can be encrypted secure message services. I cannot cite any brand here, but maybe you have them on your phone, some specific forums, and of course, all of the open source information that circulates a bit on the internet and in the background of the internet. So what makes these large language models powerful is that they don't really understand, of course, the meaning of words, but they can accurately predict what should come after a sentence based on the billion of examples that they have seen. What they actually do is analyze billions of examples of patterns, of prompts, of codes, and they learn how to statistically predict the next word or the next data or item afterwards. So threat agents, they can use this type of technology for various malicious activities, and they automate many of the processes used in, for instance, social engineering attacks, as well as create more personalized, sophisticated, and effective messaging, for instance, to full unsuspecting victims. Additionally, they can generate a greater volume of attacks in less time with a higher success rate. So If I use 3 examples, the first one will be automated malware deployment and adaptation in real time, adjusting payloads to evade detection and exploit system vulnerabilities dynamically. Because while the threat agents are developing specific prompts and instructions in order to take over a system, of course, the defense teams, let's say blue hats, the white hats, they are trying to find some defense mechanisms. So such malware can be designed, for instance, to disable satellite operations, corrupt telemetry data, or exfiltrate sensitive command and control information without triggering conventional alerts. A second example is social engineering scheme relying on psychological manipulation. In my introductory remarks, I mentioned the fact that researchers, they identified, of course, the space-to-space or Earth-to-Earth vectors essentially, perhaps Earth-to-space, but it's still to be determined. So social engineering schemes is about human vulnerabilities, but also computer vulnerabilities, because a space activity is supported by accounting and also logistics, as well as storage. And every single operation taking place in the satellite operation center, if you visited some, you can see that it's a full ecosystem, very, very interconnected and very much relying on digital technologies. So social engineering schemes, they trick individuals, they also can trick systems, but mostly individuals that can be space operators, employees, for instance, or subcontractors. And this type of threats cannot be ignored, of course. And they trick them into revealing sensitive information or, for instance, making security mistakes. And finally, of course, the password hacking with quicker and more accurate password guessing. And this is the reason why there are like different types of authentication. And what was an emerging threat a few years ago is now very much real. And this is the reason why there is a need for training of the employees. There is a need to always update the systems, always make sure that the anticipation of the next threats is, guaranteed. Of course, there is no zero risk, but this is about awareness. This is about training. This is about information sharing. And what we see at the legal level is that there are some mechanisms for incentives, for giving incentives to the operators and to the various stakeholders to share about this, because this cannot really be a secret anymore, even if it attempts to the reputation of a company, even if it is not a very popular process to communicate about a vulnerability. It's essential to be aware of what happened. Of course, sensitive and personal data were mentioned before. It can also be very much linked to the normal activities and operation of a center. It can be also linked to various contracts. This is essential to know what was released, what was stolen, and to recover as a team, also in conjunction with public authorities. And at the international level, this requires, of course, coordination between states. So this will be some of the emerging technologies creating cyber vulnerabilities. There are more, and of course, there are some that are now being developed and that I am not aware of yet, but maybe for next year.
Thank you, Laetitia, especially for your artful use of some examples of these emerging technologies that have frankly already emerged. The example that was most memorable for me in your remarks just now is the use of LLMs in user experiences every day on our phones and computers. Predictive text that you yourself have likely witnessed improve, progress over time. And I wanted to extend that analogy to the space domain. LLMs that predict what word I'll say next in my email use billions of examples of human speech, human writing. But my work at the Engineering Space Policy Laboratory at Georgia Tech is dedicated to predicting satellite behavior based on hundreds of millions of examples of past satellite behavior. Given this observation of where a satellite is going, where is it likely going next? Which is a critically helpful tool for understanding anomalous behavior, which can contribute, I argue, to legal definitions of malicious behavior. And I hope that that tantalizes you, because that really opens up a whole bunch of questions, whether we should be modeling behavior based on past practice. But as you might notice or might not notice in those LLMs that contribute to your writing processes, they get better with your own values. They notice that I use a lot of exclamation points in emails. And you can imbue values of space sustainability and security in the prediction or the prescription of satellite behavior. If satellite operators choose to ally themselves with values of space sustainability and security, they can engineer a more sustainable and secure outer space environment. The last prescribed question I have is for Simon. I believe I failed to mention in my opening remarks that Simon shares professional experience that might match some of our distinguished guests in the room. For more than 5 years, he served as the United Kingdom's Deputy Disarmament Ambassador. With that, I wanted to ask a question about strategic stability right up his alley. Simon, how are emerging technologies shaping intergovernmental space security discussions, especially around stability, crisis management, and governance? And what steps can help reduce polarization?
I would say that one of the things that is very important at the moment is the universal holistic approach and involvement of all states in space security discussions. And that's one of the things, that's been one of the good things that come out of the open-ended working groups that we've seen on space security. But one thing that I think in terms of, I mean, if you couch it in terms of strategic stability on these issues, I think the discussions amongst the major spacefaring nations on these hard security issues need to get started again. Many people, I would include myself, would say that space security issues should be on the agenda of the P5 process, for example. Obviously, that's not possible at the moment, but I would look to that process to being somewhere where these discussions, these hard security issues, could be discussed. What I think then could happen in the more universal track 1 discussions in the OEWG or other processes that are set up by the General Assembly is that they tackle some of the perhaps less hard security issues and kind of break down different topics and try to make progress on those. I think any kind of comprehensive agreement to cover all of space security is not practical, because I think it would just be impossible to have everything on the table at once, and also very challenging in today's political environment. So I think, as ever with disarmament and arms control, there's a toolkit that can be applied, and I think, you know, I mentioned track 1 processes. There's also what you can do through track 2 processes, which is what GCSP does as well. So I think again, it has to be a different initiatives complementing each other, and also importantly, I think involving all the actors. So track 1 conversations, good to see so many countries involved now, but also with track 2, you need to bring in the scientific and technical experts. The role of industry is really important as well, because states need to really understand the implications of these technologies. So quite a lot of moving pieces on the intergovernmental side of things, but so lots of work for all of us to do.
I'll add that our discussions about stability in outer space do not stop here. They continue in a dedicated panel number 5 on tomorrow's agenda. And I want to take the opportunity now to open up the floor to any questions we may have in the room. I'll do my best to balance interests from those of our guests joining online with those in the room. The same rules apply if you're in the room. Please use your name and affiliation when you introduce yourself. And you also have the responsibility of turning your microphone on and please off again after you use it. Maybe I'll start right here in the room. Pavel, go ahead.
Thank you. I'm Pavel Podvik, a researcher here at Unidir. I have a question probably for Joanna, but Thomas also kind of alluded to this. The use of AI, in particular in application to space, what we've seen so far is that AI development is driven by private companies and large ones for that, and it's a very significant investment on their part. And how do you see that interaction? Would space, if AI is applied to managing space collision avoidance, traffic, any operation in space, or the decisions about the tracking the behavior of satellites, would that be based on that development, the private companies, or you see that kind of some space AI emerging and investing, and how would you deal with the liability if something happens? Sort of who will be holding the bag in the end? Thank you.
Taking a multi-stakeholder approach to grappling with the question of liability when there are collisions in orbit, how to bring in the voice of commercial industry, but not let be the only voice in the wilderness here. Did I capture that correctly?
Well, no, it's basically, do you see that basically the AI application in space would rely on the technologies developed by a handful of private companies, or you see some other architecture emerging here?
For the clarification, yes, there is a synergy between the data that private commercial space entities bring to the table and that governmental entities are also collecting. It's an issue of trust in responsibly sharing that information and then setting parameters and how it will be used so that you mitigate the risk of unforeseen consequences, thinking about the privacy and security risks around personal data, if that is collected on an individual, and then looking at the Earth data considerations, particularly around the tracking of different refugee populations through Earth-based data that could be used in unforeseen ways. So it requires a candid conversation between these two entities to proffer the data and set guidelines on how that will be shared and what is outside of the bounds of being deemed proper for ensuring that there is trust to build a stable civil space partnership. Thank you.
Letitia and I were just commenting offline about the nature of some of these algorithms deployed by private companies. At times, it may be in their commercial interest to publish their code open source. And other times, it may be against their commercial interest to do just that. But I may highlight a mechanism that's already at play, and that's in space traffic coordination, a process in which enormous amounts of data are being passed between private companies and governments in the form of conjunction data messages. I've enjoyed looking around at people's placards, and I do encourage you to use them to see where people are visiting us today. I noticed some space operators in the audience. And when I served as a space operator in the past, I've personally experienced thousands of emails coming in describing conjunction data messages, in my case, from the US Space Force. And in practice, without the use of AI, these messages are largely ignored. And the floor is very low for deploying some sort of system to take any action at all, even very light on the kinds of constraining resources that spacecraft operators are thinking about on a daily basis, the use of limited onboard propellant. And so you see some companies describing their process for engaging with these systems as a method of advertising their sustainability hat, that I am a steward of space sustainability because I'm deploying these systems. And governments can encourage those actors to share the method by which they're adhering to those values. Share your code. And I see some promising signs from the operator community to do just that. But I don't want to paint too rosy a picture, because there are other areas where I see no pathway to the kinds of data you might like to see in a more transparent open source environment. And we have a two-finger from Iona, please.
normally legislation should solve this issue. And I need to applaud and criticize once again the European AI Act. Applaud in the sense, okay, we have the first regional legally binding regulation in place. But to criticize in the sense that it does not specifically refer to AI deployed in space, which is actually the major gap in the European AI Act. So we have multiple types of AI systems regulated based on a high risk approach. We say some systems, by we, I mean in Europe, the European legislator mentions that some systems should be prohibited because, for example, are manipulative. Other systems are high risk. Therefore, the developers, the producers must comply with very strict procedures and the technical requirements. And another category is low risk or no risk. So in this very detailed, exhaustive picture of various types of AI systems, the EU legislator did not mention, again, the legal regime of artificial intelligence deployed in space. And this is, again, one of the biggest legal gaps, because this would also solve the liability problem. In Europe, once again, we have a new product liability directive almost in force, and it is specifically connected with the AI Act. It mentions, actually refers to navigation as a critical component in AI systems. So the problem could have been solved, at least regionally, and to give a signal to the international community that we can regulate the deployment of artificial intelligence in space. And why this did not happen, I think we need to have 1 more week or 2 more weeks to discuss why the European legislator chose this approach. But long story short, I just want to say that sometimes legislation is the key to understand liability. And now the only solution is at contractual level. So again, states choosing private companies to deploy specific AI systems for them. Everything is done now at the contractual level, but it should be at the level of strong regulation.
Okay. I wanted to make an effort to include as many questions as possible and also work against my natural bias of seeing people in the front. So if you're further in the back, make more of a scene when you want to raise your hand, and I'll try to call on you. And I'll employ a strategy of taking more than one question at a time, as I find that often more than one panelist could comment if he or she chooses. So I'll start with Sana and Mr. Wong in the front. Thank you.
So I'm Sana Belgrith. I'm senior lecturer in cybersecurity at the University of Bristol, United Kingdom. My research is cybersecurity and distributed systems with a focus on cybersecurity for space. So let me steer a little bit the discussion from AI, although this is one of the research areas I work on. But I mean, the panel on the discussion has been focused mainly on tech that we know, like AI, quantum computing, and so on. But the satellite systems are systems that we built for decades. So they will be there probably until 2050, as the youth generation were telling us. The lady from UNUSA this morning said that the treaties we developed as a humanity in the 60s, we still use them because they were futuristic. So my question is, and it's to the panel as a full, how we can be futuristic as our ancestors in the 60s were, because what we develop in now will be staying there probably for 100 years, and there will be new tech emerging, not only AI, not only quantum computing, maybe some other technologies that we didn't think of. So how can we be more flexible to account for those tech that are coming in definitely in the future? Thank you.
Thank you, Thomas, for the floor. Guoyu Wang, Academy of Aerospace Policy and Law, Beijing Institute of Technology. So I thank all the wonderful presentation and interaction from the panel. If I may, I just raise a brief and simple question, hopefully. So suppose satellite data just is involved in the mission of lethal autonomous weapon system. So say providing the data for elect or select, identify or engage the target So whether, in this case, whether the satellite per se would be deemed as part of these laws or as a weapon. So that's my question to any panelists, maybe the lawyers, I'm not sure, but thank you.
If there are any panelists who are so encouraged to respond, just please let me know. Go ahead, Iana.
I think it's one of the most relevant legal topics these days. I do not want to repeat myself and say that ideally we should have an international legally binding treaty regulating the deployment of autonomous weapons on Earth, but also in space. The efforts, the international efforts nowadays are also at UN level are nowadays focusing on the legal regimes, or the legal regime of autonomous weapons, how they are deployed or will be deployed. Hopefully, not that much, but the discussion is how we deploy this type of systems on Earth. But research shows that, especially in the past and ongoing conflicts that we see, is that the majority of autonomous weapon systems are dependent on space technology. We can no longer differentiate between space technology, and autonomous technology. Space technology is a critical component for driving autonomy, irrespective of the use of the specific AI systems, either if it's civilian or if it's for military purposes. And as we mentioned, in 99% of the cases, AI is dual use, and in 99.99.99, space tech is dual use. So the differentiation is no longer possible. Therefore, any future international treaty should clarify the legal regime of deploying autonomous weapons on Earth and in outer space, ideally via an interdiction or by implementing a risk-based approach. So again, once again, the differentiation is no longer realistic.
I just wanted to highlight some gaps that we could identify while addressing these questions. The first one is the lack of understanding of technology, because it's not exactly defined. It's not really interpreted in a universal manner, but it is not what is expected now. What is expected is for experts and researchers, but also diplomats and various stakeholders to enter into discussions, to be trained on these topics, and for the broad research and the narrow research to be encouraged and perhaps a bit more founded. So this understanding will be enhanced and improved, and we can work in a more efficient way. The second gap can be the lack of coordination between the stakeholders at the various levels, at the national and international level, between states also. But we mentioned several times the involvement of commercial actors. It would be very interesting to point also their role in space activities and more in space security and the protection of outer space as a whole. Additionally, there is a lack of adaptation because we have traditional models. We have a very historical way of engaging into multilateral discussions. And this is being shaped now to the tools we have, the digital tools that we can implement, the interactive discussions like the one we have now. And this can be some solution, at least some ways to find the solutions. And if I can refer to the work of UNIDIR regarding this new ways of working on multilateral, on supporting multilateral processes, there is a space security portal that UNIDIR worked on. There is also a lexicon that helped identifying some interpretation and some definitions that I hope are useful to your research, your discussions, and that helps you in understanding space security discussions if you are not familiar with it. Additionally, we've seen this morning these exchanges between very high-level officials from the United Nations. And what we see is that there are some interconnections between the work and some intersections in some of the concerns faced. For instance, at the UNOSA level, the UNOSA supports the discussions of the Committee on the Peaceful Use of Outer Space. There are some similar, not identical, but similar issues that some of the discussions that are occurring here in Geneva. And this is very interesting to identify some of the bridges, and without mixing, without merging the discussions, at least trying to see the points of convergence. That will be ways, I believe, that to address this type of challenges.
Thank you, Thomas. Just very quickly on both questions. On the first one, unfortunately, the arms control and disarmament community is not very flexible. If you look at the history of its work, it tends to be reactive and it tends to take a long time. But I totally agree with you. It would be great to inject some strategic foresight into our work. On the second question, I mean, obviously the answer is, if there was an agreement on this, it would depend how you define weapon. Obviously, the data that goes into the system, could be seen as the enabler rather than the weapon. But one thing that did occur to me as you asked the question is, this whole question of the data that goes into weapon systems that are being used in conflict, what does that then make the satellites themselves a legitimate military target? And that, of course, then feeds into the whole discussion around the destabilizing effects and strategic stability.
So I want to take one more pair of questions, one of which will be inspired by questions we're receiving online. It's particularly for you, Jana, and it's about how states that are working together on issues of space data ethics can work around or with successful examples of state or multinational efforts to solve some of these problems below multinational fora like the United Nations. How can we not step on each other's toes as part of that process? Thanks to a visiting guest from Germany for that question. And I'll leave the last one for Ms. Patel. And with that, we'll end with some concluding remarks from our panelists. Go ahead.
Okay. So we're from Orbitac. We do something very similar in the maneuvering of autonomous space debris maneuvering. And our question is regarding data. Restrictions on space data sharing and integration may limit participation in essential activities like space traffic management, or in this case, collision avoidance. This could compromise safety and cross-border resilience while reducing private sector's access to specialized data sets and services. What are your views, or what do you think is the feasibility of creating like a clear pathway for strategic partnerships or participation in critical safety-related activities while maintaining, of course, the data set ethics?
Starting first at the global level, in terms of efforts that UNOSA could help pioneer, I would posit integrating data ethics into capacity building efforts for long-term sustainability efforts and norms discussions, perhaps considering using the opportunity of the upcoming International Astronautical Congress to convene a side group to talk about how to reach common ground when it comes to space-based data ethics. What does that look like? Let's talk about what are the fundamental principles that we would like to see represented in our working group and build a dialogue around that. So that's one opportunity. Another focused on UNIDIR is helping provide a critical lens on how space data impacts arms control and dual-use systems and crisis stability. And given the discussion in the room today of touching upon data ethics, it seems like this could also be a ripe opportunity for a future, perhaps a side working event to bring a group together to further flesh out the concerns and opportunities in this space. Lastly, across the broader UN system, treating space data as both a technical and governance challenge, one that demands multilateral solutions and thinking creatively for how to apply this to promote capacity building and an understanding of what would an ideal system look like, prioritizing respect and accountability when it comes to the ethical considerations around data ethics. There's no one way to look at this. It's very much a systems thinking perspective and understanding the economic impact, the humanitarian impact, the legal perspective on this, and what type of world do we want future generations to inhabit when it comes to space-based data, because it's only going to increase when we look at the array of technologies discussed on the panel today, particularly in the quantum space, as quantum communications and quantum internet one day become a reality. How are we governing the data that fuels these particular systems and the larger portrait that it will portray of stability in outer space? But it's a fascinating area, and I would encourage the students in this room to lean into that research question as well and form community groups around grappling with this. Thank you.
I'm also joined here on stage by some prolific writers to my right as well, and I encourage you to read their research products. With that, thank you for joining us for the first panel of this exciting agenda. Thank you to our organizers at UNIDIR. Thank you to our panelists. Please join me in thanking them.